Hello, everybody. Hi. Not sure how many of you to be here and how many of you are intentionally here, but if you just happen to be here, you're in luck. You are going to be learning about snowflakes today as part of our Digging Deeper series. My name is Ethan Davis. I work for the Sawtooth Avalanche Center. We pick a topic and then we do basically down the well over one topic just to try to dig deeper, if so to speak, on one specific topic. Today's is snowflakes. We give about 4 of these a year, and they're all back in person, which is great. If you think this is something that somebody else will want to watch later on, we're also going to be just recording these slides and my audio, so it'll be up on YouTube later, so you guys can share it. First and foremost, we want to thank the Sawtooth Brewery and Public House for putting this on. These guys are amazing folks, make delicious beer. They're super community minded, which is why they're allowing us to come here and do this for free. If there's ever a cool event in our valley, it usually has their logo on it, so make sure you support them. As a little known fact, I also used to be a beer tender at the brewery. Back when it was underneath the Ketchum Hotel over here and underneath what used to be the Clarion way back in the day. In their very first year of operation, I was one of their first hires. So yeah, it was a fun time. When we had Oktoberfest, or the version of that, I think it was their 1-year anniversary party, actually. There's a picture floating around somewhere that used to be on the wall in here of me holding a beer, or actually it was Kevin holding a beer with it frozen solid. And he's trying to, the whole bottom half of the dark beer was still in the bottom of his glass. But anyhow, also the Avalanche Center are here as well. They provide half of our operating budget, and it's through generous donations of folks like you supporting their nonprofit that supports our mission. And so give them a round of applause, please. They're out there looking out for your guys' safety, and you're looking out for each other's safety by supporting them in the backcountry. And as we discovered on December 11th this year, you don't even have to be in the backcountry affected by avalanches. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. My background is in meteorology before avalanche forecasting. I got a master's degree at Penn State University. I studied snowflakes. Essentially, who knew you could study snowflakes? And I kind of happened into it. I really enjoyed snow as a kid. I used to think that it would snow on my birthday just for me. I grew up in the Portland area, and it didn't snow very much there, but it always snowed on February 12th. So that was my little special treat. It's what got me into skiing, snowboarding, snow science, and eventually here forecasting avalanches. I worked in a lab which grew and documented the growth of ice crystals. So we used to take a little droplet launcher, kind of like a little squeezy bulb, and it would squeeze little tiny water droplets into a cloud chamber. And they had an electrical charge on them, so we could levitate them, which was pretty cool. It was my contribution to a very narrow part of science, I guess, was catching these little guys in a little cloud chamber and levitating them, freezing them, and then watching what happened when we changed the humidity and changed the temperature and froze them. So that's kind of my background and why I think I'm decently qualified, at least, to be giving you guys a talk on snowflakes. Sorry, I got to find my mouse here. Okay. So these are the guys we're going to be talking about. and we're going to be discussing snowflakes from their birth in clouds. And sorry if I'm standing over here, I don't want to try to block too much, but to their eventual demise on your sleeve. And if we're lucky, by the end of tonight, we might actually have a few falling, certainly by tomorrow morning, for you guys to check out and maybe put into practice some of the things you hopefully learned tonight. So we'll talk about the main shapes and classifications of snowflakes. We'll look at some pretty incredible images and animations of their growth, and actually some slow motion videos of their growth as well. And at the very end, if time allows, we'll have time to talk about their less sexy cousins, which would be hail, graupel, and sleet. But they deserve a mention if we have time. Not as cool as snowflakes, though, in my opinion. We want this to be pretty informal, so if at any point you have a question, just raise your hand and give me a shout, and I'll do my best to answer it as we go. So how do clouds work? If we're going to talk about ice crystals, we have to start with the basics of cloud formation, because that's really the nurseries for our little ice babies. In a very basic sense, you have water vapor, usually given off by some large water source, which almost all of that comes from the Pacific Ocean for our weather here. That moisture is pushed somewhere, usually up over a mountain, which causes it to rise, expand, and cool. And as that air mass cools, the water vapor condenses. It condenses into little water droplets, and those water droplets grow in size to form cloud droplets. And in aggregate, when you look at billions and billions of little tiny cloud droplets that you couldn't otherwise see, those turn into a cloud. This little process across the top kind of breaks it down a little bit more simply, but it also adds a little twist. We have our water vapor, we have our water droplets, they swell to cloud droplets and make a cloud, but at the center is a condensation nuclei. So this might be a new concept to some of you, but nearly every cloud droplet at the very middle of it has a little speck of dust. If we take that cloud droplet and we expose it to very, very cold temperatures, we freeze it, and this dust plays another role. At the center of this ice crystal is that tiny little speck of dust. And if you took all the snowflakes off your sleeve tonight and put them in a little pan and then melted them down and then looked at them under a microscope, you'd find dust at the center of every little drop after they've melted. And this dust turns out is super, super important for a pretty mind-blowing reason. The dust actually dictates the temperature that water can freeze. Oh, yeah, water actually doesn't always freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius. Does anybody want to raise their hand and say, yeah, I knew that? Anybody? Is it pretty shocking? Okay. Some of you out there are going, yeah, I knew that. But for the rest of you, I'll explain. So freezing is really kind of a probabilistic process. It takes all these little water molecules that are zipping around in liquid water. If you cool those down, they slow down. Their energy decreases, and they start to arrange themselves in such a particular manner that eventually they will make a little cluster. That's an ice nucleus. But they have to arrange themselves in order for their molecular bonds to be happy. So they arrange themselves in a very particular order, just like any other crystalline structure. Take like the fancy salt that you can pay $12 more a pound for. That comes in those giant crystals. Those are single salt crystals that formed in a very particular organization. Minerals are all the same. Ice is a crystalline structure, which means the molecules have to arrange themselves. So if you have a large body of water, let's say a lake, there's lots and lots and lots and lots of water molecules zipping around in there. So the odds that some of them at a cold temperature find the right orientation and nucleate and start to freeze is pretty good. That's why a pond would probably freeze close to near 32 Fahrenheit. The other thing that you need is an ice nuclei, so that little speck of dust. And that little speck of dust is molecularly similar to solid ice. So a little water molecule looks at it and says, hey, you look kind of like ice, and it sticks to it. And then another one sticks to it. And after a few more stick to it, it nucleates a little ice nucleus, but it takes that little speck of dust to help kick that off. So that's our, what I'll just call bulk water. So like in a lake situation. If you take that and you scale it way, way, way down, back to our little tiny cloud droplet, which you couldn't even see with your naked eye, there's obviously a lot less water in that cloud droplet. So the odds that it finds the right orientation already are a lot lower. It also is more pure. It has less impurities in it, less dust. And if we take a situation of cloud droplets that do have dust, dusty cloud droplets, or ones that have nuclei in them, won't actually start to freeze until around 21 degrees Fahrenheit, which is actually kind of interesting, huh? And that's with ice nuclei that are pretty favorable for creating ice. There are less favorable ice nuclei as well, that it would even be a colder temperature before you start to get ice forming in clouds. Now, if we take all the impurities out and we just have clean, pure water with no dust, no particulates in it at all, you can have clean water all the way down to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit without it freezing. Pretty cool. This is all super important because it makes a big difference in how clouds form, how ice forms, and so forth on down the road. A little experiment that I don't know, maybe some of you have seen before, is this water bottle, which is, if you take any, like say smart water, it's pretty pure. It doesn't have a lot of dust, hopefully, in it. And unopened, you can take one of these, put it in your freezer for a couple hours. The temperature, if you were to take the temperature of that water, would be well below freezing, but it would still be liquid until it gets agitated. And that's what you see in this video here, which I hope plays for us. Oh, it's playing over here. Let me bring this over. Okay. You can see the ice forming from top to bottom. That's in real time. Yeah, you can do this at home. So what's happening here is pretty incredible. It's a little bit different than having an ice nuclei in there. But if we think back to our lake, even just little rough spots on rocks and things can create a little edge where ice likes to nucleate. Oh boy, who knows what's coming on next? We better stop this. But in this case, it's the shock wave. It's a pressure wave that creates the ice nuclei. It's a pretty complicated process, but essentially if a shock wave, like say there was an explosion across the street, you'd kind of feel it like as a pressure wave that would hit you. And what's happening in this water is there's an increase in pressure and then a real rapid decrease in pressure. And when you decrease the pressure of water, it can enhance the likelihood of some of those ice nucleating sites on the inside of the water bottle. So just like a little impurity in the water bottle could become a place that would nucleate ice. So like right where you flicked it, and then it would spread throughout the rest of the water bottle. They figured this out actually because during lightning storms, you'd get the same sort of shock wave after a lightning strike, and then they'd notice that precipitation would increase right around the same time as lightning storms. So as an experiment, they took a small explosion and went to Old Faithful. This is a long time ago. And it was just a bunch of water and water vapor on a cold day at Old Faithful. And they set off an explosion next to it. And without touching Old Faithful, ice started precipitating out of it. And it was that process of the shock wave lowering the pressure really rapidly and causing ice to nucleate, which was pretty awesome. So Yeah, I know. I can see the look on some of your faces right now. We really got into it fast. And we're just getting started. But are there any questions so far about any of this? Okay, so we've established that water can exist at very, very cold temperatures in the atmosphere, a lot colder than most people thought, even up until into the 70s. So everybody knows what these are, especially if you live here. We have snow guns. So nearly all snow crystals form around some small particles. So in addition to dust, it could be soot, smoke particles. It can be bacteria even just floating naturally in the air. But these snow guns, and I haven't actually talked to the snowmakers at Baldy. Is anybody in here from there? Okay. But almost certainly they're mixing some sort of ice nuclei into their secret sauce to make snow at warmer temperatures. Because if you remember, just pure water spraying out of these guns would make an ice sheet on the run, and it wouldn't actually make any snow unless it was colder than 5 degrees. So we need to be making snow, obviously, at warmer temperatures, closer to freezing. And the way to do that is to add ice nuclei into it. It's also what we did in the laboratory when I was working in it. We added something called Snowmax to it. So ski resorts aren't the only ones. Idaho Power, so power companies, and also airports use ice nuclei. These are silver iodide flares that they fly through clouds that are just made of supercooled water in order to initiate some snowfall. So you can see how useful this would be at, say, like a major airport that's fogged in. They fly one of these planes with these flares through it at the right atmospheric conditions, the right temperatures. And as it emits silver iodide into the cloud, it starts nucleating a bunch of ice. That ice then sucks up all the available water to grow, and it clears the runway. Pretty slick. Idaho Power uses these. This is a map of our area. You see Boise here. We've got the Wood River Valley right over here, Haley, Ketchum. All these little plus signs are silver iodide exploder sites. They have a team of meteorologists that wait for the right conditions, and they sit there in the office and they go, boom, yeah, okay, now that one. At least that's how I imagine what they do. I'm not actually sure. Yeah, they're probably that excited too. And they set off silver iodide flares in these stationary locations. You can see there's a cluster of them just south and west of here in the hills west of Haley and kind of northwest of Bellevue. All these gray lines are transects that they fly. So these are all set transects that they would fly during a big storm with those planes with silver iodide flares. You might be thinking, well, that sounds illegal or dangerous or one of the above, but it's really actually not. A big question with cloud seeding is like how effective it could be. And it only increases the water amount by somewhere between 8 and 15%. So that could take a 10-inch storm, add an extra inch and a half to it is really all we're talking. But while it's not going to make a powder day for you at Galena Summit, it will increase, an inch of snow across an entire watershed. That's quite a bit of water. And when that water melts, it goes into the watershed, down the streams and into the reservoirs, which is why it's so important for Idaho Power. Yep, hydroelectric power. Mm-hmm. And I mean, the farmers benefit with full reservoirs and so forth. So it's well worth the investment at this point. And it's one of the oldest cloud seeding programs in the United States. It doesn't actually steal that much water from the total storm system. So you don't have to feel sorry for, people in Jackson. Not that anybody here is, but they're not getting any less water than we are because of this. It only takes about 1% of the total water out of a storm. I kind of think of it like as a fire hose being the storm, and then somebody's like sticking a toothpick in to deflect some of it down. And that's really all it is. It's just a tiny, tiny bit. If you take that down a notch and you look at just our ice crystals again, once a little miniature snowflake is formed, it begins to grow and develop as water vapor is released from these liquid water drops and diffuses over to the edge of the growing tips of these snowflakes. So again, it's liquid water there's water vapor mixed in all around these that we can't see, moving over to grow these snowflakes. One of the most well-known researchers of our time that probably nobody here knows, but is Ken Liebrecht. He's a physics professor at Caltech, and he is Snow Nerd famous, which means I know who he is, because I might be the only one. But his pictures were on U.S. Postal Service stamps back in the day, if you remember seeing the snowflake stamps. He also was the expert in the Disney movie Frozen for their snowflake design. So obviously he's credible. And he took this photo as well as many others that I'll be showing throughout the rest of the presentation. So props to Ken over there at Caltech. Has anyone ever seen a cloud like this? It is not photoshopped. This is called a hole punch cloud. And this is super interesting. If we take this process and zoom out and think about our cloud seeding again, this cloud is a bank of supercooled water, which means there's very little ice nuclei in there at all, mostly just really, really cold water droplets. This cloud in the center is all ice, and it's precipitating. That's what this little string coming down is ice crystals falling out. Now, how did ice get only here and none around? Well, it was nucleated as a plane flew through. So a plane flew through this location and two things happened. One, the soot from its engines gave some extra ice nuclei to the air. And two, if you know how an airplane wing works, there's high and low pressure around the wing. And that little burst of low pressure supercooled the water even further and caused it to nucleate ice as it flew through. So we created a little ice cloud, and that ice cloud is now sucking the moisture, drawing it in from the supercooled water all around it and creating this little blue hole. Okay, all right. It's good. If you saw our Instagram post earlier, this is the only thing Jackie Chan has to do with ice. Nothing really, just that he's in our presentation. So I'm hoping at this point you're starting to look at a cloud a little bit different. Instead of just looking like, oh, there's a big fluffy blob and oh, there's kind of a stringy blob, you're starting to think, wow, there's snowflakes in there. There's a lot of water vapor in there. There's water droplets in there. They're all intermixing, and it's kind of a big dynamic soup, a big swirling chemistry experiment. And we know that water is truly unique because it's the only substance to exist on Earth in all three phases, but not simply just on Earth. On Earth, in the same cloud at the exact same temperature, all three phases are present. Whew, okay, we got there. We're finally gonna dive into a little bit more about just snowflakes at this point. Snowflakes really are one of the most magnificent displays in nature. I truly believe that. They're not just made up of ordinary ice, and they are made up of ordinary ice, but they're not simply just frozen raindrops. That's a gross oversimplification that none of you will make after this. Nor do they form from liquid water. They are built piece by piece in a very deliberate manner by molecules arranging themselves in a very particular order. So here are our little water molecules, H2O, hydrogen, 2 oxygen. In liquid water, they're zipping around, like I mentioned. As you cool that down, they start to slow down. And eventually they'll arrange themselves. Oop. I don't know where my slide went. They'll arrange themselves, oh, there it is, into solid ice. And the way they arrange themselves just happens to be where the chemical bonds make the most sense for the water molecule makes a hexagon. And in fact, it makes a three-dimensional hexagon. So the six-fold symmetry of a snowflake, the smooth faces that you see on a snowflake, as well as the orientation of where the branches of snowflakes form, which would be off the corners here of these snowflakes, is all due to its molecular underlying structure. Cool, yeah, okay, yeah. So that's why snowflakes are six-sided. These are all pictures of real snowflakes. They're super, 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 super tiny. We call them diamond dust, but at the very center of every snowflake is one of these little tiny hexagons. And you notice some are thick, some are thin, like a plate. We call these plates and these columns. Very creative. And then they grow from there. So how did we go from the simplest prisms, like the ones I just showed, to an elaborate snowflake that we see on postage stamps and Christmas cards? This diagram here shows how snowflakes form at different temperatures and different humidities. So here we have increasing humidity. So we have the really, really elaborate, fancy dendrites and Christmas card snowflakes at the top here. And at the bottom, where there's low humidity, we have these simple solid plates and columns. If we look at this bottom scale, this is temperature. Temperature of 0 C or 32, so freezing here, and then colder as we go this direction. And there's a couple of interesting things that you notice. When there's more moisture in the air, you form these really pretty dendrites. When there's less, you form simpler crystals. One thing that we still don't understand, it's just been observed in laboratory settings and out in the atmosphere, is this back and forth between plates at these temperatures, near freezing, warmer temperatures, to columns all of a sudden when you trip over this little line or it gets colder, and then back to plates for some reason, and then back to a mix of plates and columns at really, really cold temperatures. And this is one of the unsolved mysteries of ice physics. We just don't know. We've observed, but we don't know why. So the question of are there any two snowflakes that are exactly the same? How in the world are they so symmetrical? I don't get that. We'll try to answer some of those questions now. These two snow crystals came out of the same cloud on the same day in the same spot. If you look really, really closely, there are actually differences between them. So the answer of, are all two snowflakes alike? Well, let's take what we know about snowflakes. If they're a product of the humidity and the temperature of where they grew, based on this diagram, then if they move throughout the cloud, let's say they start somewhere cold, then they move into some warmer temperatures near the Earth, and then they eventually fall out, the exact path of that snow crystal as it floats around and grows in the cloud even is not going to be the same as its neighbor, which floats around in the cloud. It will take a slightly different path. Therefore, there will always be some small difference between one ice crystal and another, even if they are very, very similar. You can tell there's a void space here that's shaped like a diamond. There's a void space here shaped like a triangle. There's some rhyming, so little super cooled water droplets have frozen to the edge of these. This snowflake down here, this did not fall through super cooled water, so it doesn't have any rhyming. So no two are going to be alike. Yeah. Is the shape solid with dust? Good question. So you asked if the shape has anything to do with the kind of dust that it formed around. And the answer is no. They will all form this relatively close to the same, even if this was like, say, a soot particle at the center and that was a a dust particle at the center. Really what determines the overall shape is their humidity and their temperature as they're growing. It might change the very, 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 very beginning of what it looks like. Under a microscope, you could probably tell, but otherwise we wouldn't be able to. So how can they all grow so symmetrically? Is there like a little dude over here with his hat on, radioing over to a dude over here being like, okay, it's time to branch. All right, sweet. Yeah, you go that way. You know, like, or is there some sort of like root system, like the trees talking to each other? No, it's nothing as cool as that. It's actually just that if we think back to the last example, this is just one ice crystal, and it did take the exact same path through the cloud. So it experienced all of the same temperatures and humidities. The temperature and humidity on this side is very, very similar to the temperature and humidity on that side, which is why those two branches look almost identical. It's insane, the level of symmetry though. If you start to look, even these tiniest little marks right here are repeated here. They're repeated here. It kind of looks like a fork. And it's really fascinating if you take a close look. There are some things that can make the growth asymmetrical, especially if you start to grow crystals that are more elaborate like this one at higher humidities. They grow faster, they're more unstable growth, and they're more delicate. So you have to remember these things are mixing and flying all around. You could get branches that break off if they collide with others. You could get some that just grow faster and longer than others. So the typical snowflake actually isn't a perfect symmetrical snowflake. There's usually some impurities if you look closely at one under a microscope. I talked briefly about rime. Riming is essentially like this snowflake formed and then it fell through a cloud of supercooled water. Now that having supercooled water is no longer something that's a mystery to anybody, we can all understand riming a little bit better. This water existed, these little droplets were all below freezing, just hanging in a cloud, a big cloud of supercooled water. And the snowflake fell through, and as it fell through, all those little droplets stuck to that crystal and instantly froze. If you keep doing this to a snowflake, what do you end up with? Close, graupel, yeah, graupel, or soft hail, some people call it, or pellet snow. I've heard a few different terms for it, but it looks kind of like hail, but it's not pure water ice. It kind of feels airy and soft, and you're looking at a big pile of supercooled water that froze to a snowflake at the center. So there are two primary ways that an ice crystal can grow and that end up shaping the snowflake. There's faceting, which literally just means little face, which makes the flat edges. And then there's branching. When we have our water vapor coming to an ice lattice, it's more likely to stick to these rough spots. And if you get more sticking in this here, you'll eventually make this sharp corner while others bounce off, okay? And the reason that this is the case is because the molecular bonds are more available for this molecule to adhere than they are here. So a bunch of this water vapor is just bouncing off, while at the rough spot at the corner, it's starting to incorporate, and you start to create this hexagonal shape, which is the molecular shape of water. So that's faceting. You can see the remnant hexagon here really clearly, huh? At the center of this ice crystal. And then as it grew and grew and grew, eventually it got to this level, which is also a hexagon. And at some point, it decided to burst out a little branch. And the reason that it burst out a little branch right there is because this little point, or if you think about it, this little corner of that ice crystal is sticking out a little bit further than everything else. So if we look at it on a small scale, this is that little point, and it's sticking out into this field of water vapor, which is what it needs to grow. And because it's sticking further out, it has better access to the water vapor, and therefore it grows a little bigger. And now it's sticking even further out into the water vapor, and it grows a little bit bigger. And that causes the instability of growth that shoots off a growing branch of a snowflake. Pretty cool. Are there any questions about snowflake growth? So what I'm hoping now is that your brain's starting to look at this, and instead of just seeing a pretty snowflake, you're going, oh, at the very, very center is this tiny little speck of dust or soot or bacteria. Then it nucleated into ice, which started as a little hexagon. And this is the oldest part of the snow crystal. It's younger and younger as you come out towards the edges, okay, just like the rings on a tree. And as it's growing, at some point, it got really high humidity and it started this branch. And then it slowed down and it started to make a facet, like a face, a smooth face. And then the humidity got cranked up again and it branched, and those grew out again, and so on and so forth. So now we can look at this snowflake and say it's older to younger, and its growth history, literally its path that it took through the clouds is etched in ice. And you can kind of see that if you know what you're looking for. When it's making these flat faces, it's lower humidity or colder temperatures. When it's making these branches, it's really, really high humidity. Okay, that was the last time for that. But seriously, how is your brain doing? Everybody good? Okay, good. So classifying snowflakes is a bit of an art, but it does help us have some way to communicate what we're seeing. All snow starts in one of these basic shapes. So either a flat plate or a column. These are what we referred to earlier as diamond dust, and they're super tiny. So you don't have to take a hair, but if you did take a hair, find one on your neighbor's shoulder that they aren't seeing. And look at the end of it. That's about 20 microns across. And the diameter of these little snow crystals is half of that hair. So it's super, super tiny. So all snowflakes start as diamond dust. A very quick, but I find interesting tangent are these. So halos around the sun and around the moon. These are due to those teeny tiny ice crystals, diamond dust, okay? And what's happening is the moonlight is coming through, it's being bent as it goes through the ice crystal, and it's separating the visible spectrum of light, which is why you see the different colors as you look up into the sky. So if you look at the sun, which I was doing on a run out Croy earlier, trying to look for a halo for you guys, I did not find one. Not advised though, is some of the light is actually passing straight through to your eye. Some of the light is coming and getting bent by a snow crystal and then coming in at an angle. And so what you're doing is you're actually seeing this light as a circle around the sun because it's being bent by those little teeny tiny ice crystals. And there are all kinds of different atmospheric halos out there, depending on what kind of ice you're looking at and what angles you're looking at. This is the most common one. And you may have heard like, oh, there's a halo, that means weather's coming. Has anybody ever heard that before? And it actually is fairly true, maybe more true if you're out on the ocean somewhere, because what you're seeing is you're seeing the very, very beginning of a weather system coming. Usually weather systems come in from the top and move their way down. So you'll see ice start to float in at high levels in the atmosphere, and then eventually the cloud deck lowers and lowers, and then it's cloudy, and then it's precipitating. So that actually has some truth to it. These are all, not all, but most of the types of ice that you might actually see falling out of the sky. And a lot of them probably, well, some of them probably look pretty familiar, and some of them look pretty exotic, I'd imagine. The familiar ones here are kind of the dendrites, maybe these sectored plates or simple plates or columns. But then there's this wide variety of really interesting ones. So we'll talk about a few of those because they're the ones that we're less familiar with. These again are all pictures of real ice crystals. We have some more common looking ones, but we even have triangular ice. It's again one of those mysteries. So I couldn't answer your question of how does that happen? We still don't know. Yeah.
I've seen snowflake shapes on my.
These ones, you would benefit from having a little like a slide loop to look at, like slide film is like a good way to do it, or some little magnifying glass. But most of them of these sizes are going to be easy to see. Even yeah, even these ones on your coat. So they might be like a few like millimeters across, maybe 3 or 4 millimeters. Yeah. We have 12-sided or 12-pointed crystals, which I know I told you they only have 6, and now I'm lying to you, but I'll explain those here in a minute. We have these ones that kind of come out at all directions. Those are really interesting. We have columns that then have caps on the tops of them, like plates growing on the tops of them. Here's an example of that one too. So let's dive into some columns. If we look at our little diagram, we see columns form here. We see columns form here, usually low humidities. One of the more interesting types of columns are what we call needles. You see needles occur only in the atmosphere at -5 or about 22 Fahrenheit. So if you've ever been walking through a storm and you feel the ice like literally like stinging your face and you're just like, man, what is that? It's actually these little buggers. And you can tell your friend that probably will just look at you in amazement and say, those formed at -5 degrees Celsius. And you'll just shock them with your knowledge. So these little needles only form at that temperature. What's kind of cool here is you can see there's a little void here, a little gap of air, a hollow space inside this column. And that's because as the water vapor was adhering to the edges of this column, it's getting taken up by the crystal before it can make its way into the center. So it starts to form a little cavity as it grows out. If we take a simple column here and then we start to fall down from a really, really cold, this is -20 Fahrenheit, say down into something more mild like 25 degrees plus Fahrenheit, we might start with one of these hollow columns and then a plate forms on the end. So look for these on your sleeve. They're a little bit more common than you'd think. Ooh. Yeah, 12-sided snowflakes. These are actually 2 snow crystals, so we're cheating. 2 that are stuck together with a 30-degree twist. So I have been kind of using snow crystal and snowflake interchangeably, but snow crystal is literally just one crystalline structure. It started from a point and it grew out. A snowflake is a conglomerate of multiple different snow crystals that have formed. Or in this case, there were 2 that had like a 30-degree twist to them, like that, and then they grew. And it's really pretty clear to see in this one, which has a shallow depth of field photograph, where the photographer photographed just the top one, which you can tell is in focus, and then the back one, which is behind it, but connected to it, providing the rest of the 6 branches. Pretty spectacular though. Triangular snow crystals. I have seen these. I do a lot of digging in the snow as part of my profession. So it took a while, but I did find one. They do exist. And finally, a lot of the studies and a lot of what we know about snow crystals is from growing them in laboratories. So we're winding down here and I'll show you some cool animations. This is sped up, but this is an actual snowflake growing in a laboratory being recorded. Pretty spectacular stuff. And again, when we're there's some nerdy scientist, actually it's Ken, if you imagine him at Caltech in his little lab. And he's just playing with the knobs of humidity and temperature. And that's how he's getting this snow crystal to do what he wants. He calls them designer snowflakes. He's literally thinking to himself, man, if I reduce the humidity right now, I'm going to form one of these stripes. And then if I crank it up, it's going to grow a little faster and it's going to get thinner. And then I'm going to reel it back again and I'm going to make another stripe because I like the last one. And now I'm going to build a third one. And then I'm going to crank the humidity all the way up to 10. And I'm going to make a branching instability that shoots off to really as a grand finale at the end to make it nice and pretty. So he's literally designing these as he goes. Here's another one where he gets even more carried away. And what's nice to see here is you can see the water, the liquid water condensing on the outside here. And as that snow crystal starts to extend toward it, it's pushing that water back because it's literally eating the water as it goes. Yeah, great question. So I suspect that because we're seeing condensation in this video that he's growing it either in a solution, like it's floating in some sort of solution, like a gel or something, or it's on a slide. But the one on the previous, what he actually does is he takes glass and he heats it up and he draws it out into a super fine tip. And silica is a common crustal material that happens to have the same, molecular structure similar to ice. So it's really good at nucleating ice. So he draws it really fine. And then he sticks it into his cloud chamber and cranks things up. And the ice preferentially starts to form right on the tip of that glass. And then I think in the post effect, he removes that for these animations.
In nature, assuming that all points grow at the same rate as they do with the lava, what would make certain points grow at a rate?
Two things. One is the higher the humidity, the faster the growth rate. So actually, if we watch this one again, and you just pay attention to when there's a branch tip, you'll see that it starts to move faster. Right now, see it move now. Faster again, and then it slows down and creates the little stripes. So one is the humidity and the other is actually the thickness of the leading tip. So if it's really thin, it draws moisture faster. If it's a thicker crystal, it goes slower. And I don't know how fast these are sped up, but it seems likely that this grew that big in the course of under an hour. Yes, very good. Yeah, low humidity, and it just because he wanted really simple faceted growth to make a big fin at the end. Yeah, exactly. So if you remember, crystals are either plates or they're columns. So there's two different directions that they can grow. And when you see those stripes form, instead of preferentially growing on the prism face or the plate face, it starts to preferentially grow on the columnar face. So it actually makes, if you looked at it on end, those little lines are ridges. They're actually, you could feel them, they're bumps. Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Jackie. All right, and then, so as we're wrapping up here, I'll leave you with some of his more spectacular designer snowflakes that he's photographed and made in his lab. And finally, we arrive at the sad time where our little ice crystal leaves its safe, humid environment up in the clouds, and it comes down into the real world with honking horns and sleeves and people going, "Is that a needle? Oh, -5." And and they start to wilt and decay. But I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I applaud your curiosity. I hope you picked up at least a tidbit or two that is worth sharing with your buddies later. And I encourage you to take a look at your sleeve tonight or tomorrow and start thinking not about what the crystal looks like, but think in your brain of, wow, how did it get to look like that, based on what you now know. And I'll leave you with this quote: "How full of creative genius is the air in which these are generated. I should hardly admire more if real stars fell and lodged on my coat." Thank you guys very much. Grab another beer, and I'll answer some questions. Yeah.
Well, I didn't really think about that, but in your opinion, what type of snow crystal formation would produce like the lightest fluffy snow?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. So the lightest, fluffiest snow will almost certainly be ones at higher humidity that pack less densely. So if we're talking, avalanches here, we talk about wind slabs. Wind slabs are just all the, beautiful creation of the atmosphere just crushed up into an ugly little pile. And it gets more dense because there's less air there. So it's broken off all the branches, or most of them, and broken them in half and stuffed them all together. So obviously that's on one end. If we just have plates dendrites falling with light wind, so they're falling very, very slowly, they're not breaking their arms off. And if they are interlocking, they're just barely touching and coming down together. That'll be the lightest, driest, powdery snow out there. Yeah. What's interesting is who here has seen a single snowflake? Show me on your hands, like the biggest one you've ever seen. And I'm not talking ice crystal, a snowflake, which would be multiple ice crystals. Yeah, there. Okay, I see a lot of this going around. Okay. Would you believe me if I told you that the biggest one I ever saw was this big? Yeah, in nature, not in some fancy NASA laboratory. I was in Valdez, and it was very, very warm, wet snow falling with almost no wind. And all of a sudden, I saw this, what looked like a white plate just come down by itself and just go poof. And I was like, oh, who threw that? Like I didn't recognize it as snow at all. And then one landed on my shoulder. And I was like, that was snow. And I look around, and then there was one every about 100 feet coming down. And somewhere in the atmosphere, they'd been floating around. You have to remember that they don't just fall. They kind of hover because there's updrafts in clouds. And so they can grow pretty large. And they just kind of stuck, like you were saying, together, and eventually got big enough that they overcame the updraft and then fell down as like a giant plate. It was pretty wild. Yeah. Yeah, so it really depends on where it grew in the atmosphere and how fast. So as I mentioned, in order for it to fall, it has to overcome the updraft. So if it gets to be really elaborate dendrite, it can float up there pretty easily. If it's a more dense, smaller crystal, it might start to fall more rapidly. But on the order of an hour, if it just formed and then fell. But remember, the atmosphere can go to like 40,000 feet where you can still be making snow and making ice crystals way, way, way up where, the top of the troposphere. And if you're up there, it could take a really long time, or they might just evaporate. They might not actually come all the way. When you see the two crystals form the 12-branch plate, what causes the 30-degree offset? And is it always 30 degrees, or always a strong word? Right. Yeah, it's not always. That's how we get some of these weird ones that I guess, so the answer to your question is when it freezes, sometimes it's a pretty violent like glaciation. Like you saw when they flicked the water bottle, it happens fast. And sometimes nature gets a little disorganized. So the next best formation outside of the perfect is a 30-degree twist. Beyond that, it could come out, they call them spatial dendrites, where they come out, there's branches coming out this way and that way and all sorts of different directions. And that literally is just a dislocation right as it freezes. The most common dislocation is a 30-degree twist, but there are others. Yeah.
Do you think that the biggest dendrites will form in that 15 to 5 range or more closer to 30?
Definitely the -15 range. Yep, these are the biggest. These are also, they're not exactly to scale, but the fact that this one is bigger is supposed to depict that those are the largest. And to answer what is the largest single snow crystal ever found, it was almost 2 inches across. And it was a single snow crystal, not a bunch stuck together. And that grew in Canada somewhere that somebody photographed. Yeah. Yes.
Kind of different, but could you talk about like how and if these rules still apply for something like the process of faceting? That's like based on a vapor pressure differential, right?
Yeah.
Which is different than the symmetrical formation of the snowflake, but those same rules apply?
They do. Yes. So the question was, how does this relate to faceting in the snowpack? And it's actually super similar. So the reason that we get more kind of variety here in the atmosphere is just because the vapor gradient that you referred to is stronger. It's more, so these are growing faster with higher supersaturation or higher density gradients of vapor transport. In the snowpack, there's water vapor moving to form surface ore, for instance, or facets as well, but it's moving at a much slower rate. So remember when we were watching them grow? When they were growing slowly, they were making facets, which is exactly what's happening in the snowpack when we're making facets. If we could crank the supersaturation up and give it a bunch more moisture, we might start growing little branches inside the snowpack, but we can't do that. If you think about surface ore, how many of you have seen surface ore growing that looks kind of sparkly? And when you look closer, it looks like a bit of a V shape and it has lines. Those lines are those same lines that I was talking about when we were watching those lines grow on the snowflake. Those lines were formed when the vapor was reduced. There was less humidity. It started to thicken the crystal and you got a little rib. Then it started to grow faster and it was flat and then there was a little rib. So when we get these little striations in our surface ore, it's the same process. Surface ore also grows like feathers. Is that a high humidity thing or a low humidity thing? If it looks really elaborate and has feathers, high. So it's the same thing. Mm-hmm.
So kind of on that same thread, when you have different types of facets, like when you say they're like cup or branch or whatnot, is that like more a function of their age or more a function of the conditions of the stuff?
It's a function of both because they have to get to a certain size in order for some of those shapes to start to manifest. And sorry, it was, yeah, time. And also you had another factor. Yeah. Age, yeah, age and size of the crystal. And I can't tell you exactly why like cupped facets form, but my assumption would be that just like the end of a column that has a hollow opening, it's because as it's growing, it's preferentially growing on the rim. And the water vapor arriving at that crystal gets incorporated there and doesn't make it to the inner part. And so as it grows, it makes that cup deeper and deeper. So older crystals will show cups. Yeah. Whew. I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry. But it would be a pretty good approximation if you had, you know, like a kitchen scale at home and took an eyedropper and put a tiny drop of water on it. Yeah, that's about how much water you'd get out of one big snowflake. Yeah. Yeah, you might. Yeah, that's a great point. Huge vapor source. You might call it cavity ore, depending. Sometimes it's like the creeks kind of get trapped where there's only little openings. So that lets the water vapor build up a lot in there. But in a very vapor rich environment like that, it'll grow more elaborate feathery crystals. Yeah. Cool. Well, if there are any more questions, please come up and ask me. And thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. Yeah. Hey.
Yeah.
Oh, you're Desiree. Yeah. Yeah, cool. Finally to meet you. Yeah, yeah. You bet. Yeah, no, thank you so much for all the stuff you're sending. Yeah, oh, and you made my day by saying vapor gradient, which you know, yeah.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I feel like it's even this season. I'm trying to remember now the name of it. Obviously, I read like Staying Live and Avalanche Terrain every year and everything, which doesn't do a lot about just like the physics of
Welcome. You're welcome.
Now I can't remember the name of the book, but I like picked up a different book this year that talks about like snowflake building and degradation. Like everything is a derivative. Substrate. Everything's a derivative of vapor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's all a matter of, you know, a lot of people's like a misnomer that unfortunately is in everything that's taught is that temperature gradients build surface ore, and it's not. It's actually vapor density gradients that build surface ore. They are related, but it's a much more complicated topic to try to teach somebody. So it's
like hidden and like the temperature is easier to explain.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you have warmer temperatures, generally speaking, there's more water vapor available. If you have colder temperatures, then there's less water vapor available. So they just call it a temperature gradient. But really, if there's more of something someplace and less of something someplace, it's just a gradient of that something, and that something is water vapor. It's not of temperature.
This is another random question. Since like very new to solids, but I see much more of these like needle-like formation on trees than I did in like the Wasatch and the Bear. And I can't figure out why that is. I'm like, have I just not been like
This season has been really weird. And I'm not sure if you're referring to rhyming. Yeah, you bet. Of course.